Could the sign of Baal appear in the land? Could the sign of Baal, the sign of a nation that has turned away from God, a nation that has embarked on defiance of God and judgment, could that sign appear in this land? And we are here today to witness that sign appearing on American soil. And it is September 19th, 2016. I'm standing in New York City, in City Hall Park, on a rainy Monday afternoon, a little past 1. And what you see in back of me, about to be unveiled, covered up, is the arch that led to the Temple of Baal. In a moment, they're going to have a ceremony, they're going to unveil it, and there'll be American leaders here, and what you will see on American soil is the sign of Baal. Here now on American soil, in back of me, is the manifesting of the sign of Baal. This is a reproduction of the arch that stood in Syria that led to the Temple of Baal, the arch through which the worshippers of Baal would go to worship their God, the God of Israel's apostasy. Baal in America, the God that is there at the time of the harbingers, the time of judgment. This is the sign, this is what led to, and this is what a sign of a nation that is leading to judgment. Baal, the sign of a nation that departed from its God. Baal, the sign of a nation in apostasy from God. Baal, the sign of a nation that once knew good and evil and now calls evil good and good evil. Baal, the sign of a nation that offers its children as sacrifices. Baal, the sign of a nation that persecutes the followers of God. And now, September 2016, this harbinger has appeared to America.
He may have just been tasered. Shots fired! Ooh. 321, we have shots fired. We have one suspect down.
After Tulsa police officer Betty Shelby shoots him, you can see him lying on the ground unattended for an extended period of time. His blood is spreading out across his chest and the street. He's still alive at this point, yet the officers are not rushing to try to save his life. It's a scene that infuriates many and one that is repeated for us to see, whether it's an injured person like Crutcher lying there or Michael Brown's dead body in Ferguson. How soon should officers switch from a tactical situation to a medical situation? And are police officers required to render medical aid to people they've shot? To help answer that question, I'm joined by retired Philadelphia Police Captain Ray Lewis. Captain, thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to ask first, are officers required to immediately provide medical attention? What's common protocol here?
Obviously, that's the basis of all police work, the protection of life and property. So no matter whether he's a bad guy or a good guy, you have to render first aid once the threat is neutralized.
So as humans, we see these videos and we immediately want to see someone rush to their help. That person's lying there on the ground. What stops officers from doing that? We've seen it time and time again. There's a pause. So what is that pause?
Primarily two reasons. Number one, the officers are never held accountable. I don't know of one case in this entire country where an officer was fired due to not rendering first aid. Not one. So they're never held accountable. That's number one. Number two is the attitude police officers have toward minorities in these neighborhoods. I worked with an individual, and he once referred to the minority members of the community we worked in as roaches. If you shoot a roach, you're not going to be that interested in rendering first aid.
It's a sad reality there. Captain, you were talking about accountability. In Baltimore, Freddie Gray's requests for medical attention were ignored. He ended up dying from the injuries he sustained with his interaction with officers. No charges stuck, though 6 officers were charged. How can officers be held accountable for not rendering aid in cases like this?
It all comes down to the responsibility of the community. They have got to put pressure on the mayor.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan central bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the US government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which US officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The US is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the US military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system. Remember that when these wars extend and accelerate. Remember that when your son or your neighbor's son comes back home in a flag-draped coffin. Remember that when they point the finger at the new boogeyman, because the madmen who are running this show will take this as far as you allow them to. So how much time do we have left? It's a question I hear constantly.
Well, this is just weird. It's more than weird, it's strange. Here we are at a solemn event. We are at a funeral for 5 dead people. As you can see, Joe Biden has his solemn face on. That's the face you should probably have on when you're at something like this, an occasion. This is just weird. They say that Bill Clinton has been acting weird lately. But chalk this up for another president acting extremely strange. Now,
the problem is the monopoly game, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve, the private bank, which is actually controlled out of London, is manipulating all the dollars to put them out, put more and more people into debt. So the illusion of equity they have in real estate is coming apart. The players that are analyzing everything are expecting massive foreclosures next year and the beginning of what we call the recession it's going to be worse than 29. It's your house that you're living in. You think you own it. You don't.
Right.
You have contractual right to transfer the airspace, subject to you paying taxes to the state.
Right.
Or the Global 2000 discussions that we had. The real problem that they have, as Kissinger says, is there are just too many people on the planet. And 40% of the world, 2 billion of us, exist on less than $2 a day. The summary of the Global 2000 report I put up on my website, nohoax.com, but if you look at it, it makes sense to get rid of people. So what they said, they're going to make godlike decisions on who lives and who dies. Now, obviously, some of the meetings we sat on, we were planning on using neutron bombs on the major cities, because that contains most of what they call...
You actually heard this?
I sat in on the meetings. I was in the game big time. In fact, I was making such a mess, they decided rather than kill me, which they could, they just invited me into the inner group and asked me to be the finance chairman. And at that point, I probably would have been in, you know, Secretary of the Treasury or something, whatever they wanted to do with me. What I was doing prior to that, so, you know, making it right, I would volunteer to become a president of a company, and I'd go in and liquidate it. And we get rid of the expendable containers. That was my job.
Expendable containers meaning human beings?
That's right.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's
well, that was the
inside
terminology.
vernacular, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, well, that's what we used at that time. I mean, it went from there to useless eaters today, so you're happy with it, you're a human resource. So, which, you know, all you are is part of the commodity, even in the business sense. You look at it, you have a cost. Labor, what is labor? Yeah. Human resource. Right. When you're going to put together some kind of product. Well, the inside of the game, when we started to use neutron bombs, today they figure that biologicals are much cheaper. They're still planning on, the plan is to get a war started in the Middle East, and they're still planning on using a neutron bomb, or one of the bombs that they've got developed on Israel, and that's to begin World War III, which is all on the cards. And it's going to happen. They even put a monument up to this whole program. It's called the Georgia Guidestones. You know, outside of Atlanta, you know, and they've got it all set down there. It's all in 8 languages. They want basically it's fait accompli as far as they're concerned. It's just to get the thing going in the Middle East, and it's not going fast enough. I mean, Carter put this thing in, so we have the Plan 2000, with the war starting in the year 2000 in the Middle East. Right. Reduce the population of the planet down to 500 million. Have one world currency under the Homeland Security, or FEMA, if you want to call it. They're going to declare an emergency, which are going to shut down everything. My friends, my CIA associates, I don't even call them friends anymore. CIA is crooks in action. Yeah. They're all professional liars. Yeah. I mean, they got to be if they have that job. Yeah. So you have to look at what they're doing. Anyway, they're so concerned, they're leaving the country too. Most of them are going to Latin America. Meanwhile, they're closing in every day right now, just closing in to make it so we're going to be set up in these enemy prisoner war camps. I published a book. It's called Chaos in America. In it, I was asked to build an enemy prisoner war camp. I put the contract in this book, so you can read it for yourself. This is in downtown Las Vegas, right on the railroad tracks. It says enemy prisoner war camp. They're all on top. And they're building them all the way across the United States right now. Bush signed an executive order taking the old forts and the army places that we shut down to get those organized to hold the so-called dissidents. Now, what's the definition of a dissident? And the problem is that we're going to enslave ourselves, because most of the people want to keep having food coming in, and you're going to follow the line. You're just walking yourself into your own prison camp. Then we're going to come down to the extermination, just like World War II. Right. Well, Phil and I have lectured together. I know Phil Snyder. He's dead now.
Yeah, I know he's dead. And so what about what he was saying about the number of bases at that time? I think it was 129 bases before he died. Underground had already been built. Is that all for the elite?
Yeah.
Really?
What are they going to do with the rest of the people? They just get rid of them, leave them above ground, and be radiated. Now, my son happens to be a nuclear physicist. Spent the last 3.5 years in a secret city in Russia. They're about 12 years ahead of us. They have 22,000 nuclear warheads. And of course, we're the target. The Soviets have 3 nuclear submarines on the west coast and 3 on the east coast. They're about 2 football fields in length, 5 stories tall, and they all are nuclear power and aimed at our major cities. West Coast's gone. Well, because the plan is the Northern Hemisphere is where they're going to release the nuclear bombs, and the theory was that the winds from the North Pole that are coming down, because that's increasing drastically, will go to the equator, and there will be very little spillover because of the reverse of the winds, because of the Southern Hemisphere.
Okay.
So therefore, the nuclear radiation here will be a lot more than the Southern Hemisphere.
And this is a fait accompli, you believe?
Oh, they think so. Oh, yeah, they think they've won. That's the reason why they don't bother about me talking about it. They don't care whether you know or not. What are you going to do about it? And you have no idea what China is until you go over there for yourself. With 1,300,000,000. You understand? Almost, well, a little over 4 times our population.
Right.
It's, you know, I spent some time over there and I had some government friends. They think what they're going to do is let the West go have its fight. And then they want to clean up. They say it's been 5,000 years. We want to run the world when we get through. And what they're doing? Acquiring all the assets. They figure that Canada and the United States, the property there will, the food growing areas will be enough to take care of their people. And that's what they're looking at. Why are they? I mean, they bought
so
oil.
the U.S. will become a resource. Yeah.
Whatever's left of it.
Whatever's left of it. Yeah. You seem to be in a unique position to be able to put a fair amount of this together, which is quite interesting.
Well, I walked my talk. I played the game.
You played the game. You know one level of it.
And I know. I used to play around with the world leaders, so I know what they're planning on doing.
What change of heart? What happened in you that made you decide to share this information that happens at the inside levels?
Well, it come back to a moral situation that happened to me, I think. When I flew to Aspen. I brought my 2 daughters up there so they could go skiing. And when I was invited to this meeting. When I walked into the room, the world leaders were there, and that's when they asked me to be the finance chairman. As they said, we'd like you to be the finance chairman for the next president of the United States. And the first thing I asked is, why me? And they said, well, we owe you a favor. Remember I told you I volunteered to be president of companies as I went down.
And then you liquidate, yeah.
I didn't charge them anything for it. It was just a game.
I see.
And anyway, that's what they said.
So I thought you'd be good on the team, yeah.
I'd be good. I'd be a team player. I just did it because it was, another one of these things. So next thing I asked them, I said, well, wait a minute. I just started this $100 million project. And they said, don't worry about it. We'll put it on ice. And I said, okay, who with? And I said, well, you can do that. Then I said the next thing was, who is going to be the next president? Now, this is 2 years before he became president.
Right.
And they said Jimmy Carter. And I said, Jimmy who? And they said, well, he's the Democratic governor of Georgia. And I said, I've been voting Republican. And Paul Volcker said, son, don't worry about it. We control them both.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I got the next question is, what does a finance chairman do?
Yeah.
I haven't been doing that. I've been playing all this other stuff. They said, will you sit down with Ted? And so I sat over with Ted Kennedy. He's sitting right next to me. And Ted and I are, he's just joking. He says, George, you're going to love this job. You're really good with money. We're going to send you out to all the state Democratic functions to raise money for the National Democratic Party. And he said, you're going to meet some real foxy ladies. And just then, my daughter walked in. Ted looked at her and he says, wow, I want to go to bed with that. I says, no, you don't, Ted. That's my daughter, and she's 14. And his response to me was, I don't care. I was livid. I really didn't know what to do.
So it was that moment
Well,
of
wait a
that
minute.
personal insult.
That was part of it.
Yeah.
I got up, I walked across the room.
Yeah.
I then talked to Pierre Trudeau and his wife, who was the Prime Minister of Canada at that time. And I'm sitting in front of them was a little half cigar box full of white powder. And then I'm looking around the rest of the room. I said, my God, something hit me at that point. If the world leaders have to resort to this, I don't think I want to be part of this thing. I mean, even to the even to the pollution and getting everything else they're talking about, getting rid of all the other people. I mean, I was raised in a packing house and slaughtering animals, and you get to the point where people are just animals at that level. And then I found out a little bit more about the details of the Plan 2000, of the annihilation of the entire planet. I said, I got to stop these people. There's something there. I mean, it was just, they got to be stopped.